What's up, everybody? A Sparrow with a Gun here from Sleepless Night Studios, and I'm bringing you kind of something new for my channel. I don't normally do this kind of stuff, but I thought it would be kind of helpful for the game Genesis Alpha 1. I wanted to do kind of like a beginner's guide, because although there was some things, there is a tutorial in the game and stuff like that, there's still a few things that I think are left out. Could be intentional to make the game more challenging, I'm not sure. But I thought it might help some new players since the game was fairly new and there probably isn't as much guide-like content on it. So here's my kind of like top 10 things for beginners that I think will help that the tutorial doesn't inherently tell you about. So the first one is to plan your layout. In the very beginning, this doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal because you can only build the greenhouse and the tractor beam room as part of the tutorial, and so it doesn't really tell you, or it doesn't really give you very much wiggle room as you can only place them in certain spots. But one thing is that the green room is very important to the overall success of your ship because it provides the atmosphere so you can all breathe. The tractor beam is also very important in terms of gathering resources, but it also creates the first point that you can get invaded from, which is the tractor beam room. So I've found personally it very useful to sometimes keep them separated, like put the green room over on the one side and put the tractor beam somewhere else. I kind of like to put the tractor beam, refinery, and harvester rooms kind of in the same spot, so I have all of my problem areas right there. And I like to try and keep them as separated as possible, like don't build other rooms past those if I can help it, so that they're kind of isolated. That'll bring me to a later point about securing the risk rooms, or what I'm calling risk rooms. But for first of all, though, the biggest thing is planning your layout around that kind of idea of knowing which rooms can cause problems, which, as I said, as of the time of this video, I believe it is the tractor beam room, the harvester, and the refinery are the three places that you can get, and I'm not sure about the refinery, but I think it can. But those are the three places that I believe you can get infestations or invasions from. So, with that, I definitely would plan your layouts to take that into account. So the second point is not to leave your tractor beam room unattended. This can be accomplished in two ways. And what I mean by unattended is not letting it run a process while you're not actively in the room. The two ways you can accomplish this is by unassigning all crew. So even though the tutorial tells you to, what I like to do is to assign the crew and then immediately remove them. And that way they are not working on anything. This can also be accomplished by just deactivating the beam. You can go back into the console once the crew's been assigned if you want to keep somebody in the room, and then you can just tell it not to be trying to beam anything up. That also works. But basically what can happen is, as I said before, as you beam things up, there is a chance of you beaming either aliens or some kind of invader along with the materials you're getting. And so it can cause a problem if left unattended, because either the crew isn't enough to get all of the things, or there's no crew in there and it's just been auto-beaming or whatever. So either deactivating or not having a crew is a good idea. You don't necessarily have to do both, because if you don't have anyone active in the room, they won't be working on beaming anything up, and that is a very slow process. So I have not really encountered a lot of situations where you get resources unless you're actively operating the machinery or you have a crew member there. It rarely gets enough traction to do it on its own. So usually one or two of those should be fine, either removing the crew or stopping the beam. But it cuts down on any kind of invaders when you're not around, which leads to the next point of securing these risk rooms. As I mentioned before, I try and keep the harvester, the refinery, and the tractor beam kind of all in one little cell. Now, eventually, later on in the game, you can get stuff like scanner corridor hallways and things that can remove invaders and infestations and things like that, because it can't get past that room. But early game, that's not really available to you unless you got super lucky and found one. But even then, you have to build those as if they're a corridor, and so it doesn't really help you with already existing rooms. So I like to plan those risk rooms in their own little cluster kind of thing, which goes back to the first point. But in securing them, I find using the basic turrets are very useful, at least in early game. I don't know about some of the late game enemies and stuff like that, but at least early on, then you can basically use those to secure things. Again, I like to kind of be in the room of the tractor beam room when doing things, so some of that's a little alleviated, but it's still nice to have turrets in there. But the biggest places I would put your turrets is in the access corridors, or access ways, tunnels, because you get these little bug aliens and things that can get in there, and they just, they cause a problem kind of thing. And at least up in the main walkways, you kind of would run into them and you'd see them before it got crazy. Normally, I knock on wood, ideally, all things considered. But down in those access ways, you don't normally go there unless you're specifically looking for aliens or something like that. So placing the turrets right in those access passages seems to pretty much alleviate the problem where nothing really gets through those little tunnels. I like to put a couple, for example, if I've got my tractor beam room on the main connection part to the rest of the ship, and then the harvester and refineries connected to the tractor beam, I like to put another turret right in front of the main door and the access hatch for the rest of the ship, and that way, even if the refinery and tractor beam and harvest all get infested, they can't get through, or at least it's difficult for them to get through to the rest of the ship. And like I said, this won't fix an infestation completely, but it'll prevent one from happening because you only get a couple of things that spawn and it takes them out before they get away. And you don't necessarily have to have every single room covered, but I would cover your access point to the rest of the ship from those risk rooms. But in my experience, if you're managing your tractor beams and you've got your turrets set up in those ways, it doesn't really become that much of an issue anymore. The harvester, in my experience, which is still limited, I haven't had a whole lot of time with the game yet, but in my experience, the harvester does not bring back aliens if you're on the expedition with your crew. That could be incorrect, so if so, do let me know in the comments so that I can make alterations to this type of guide list. But in my experience, if you go with your crew, then normally aliens don't come back with you. But if you send the two of your crewmen out and you just have them go pick it up, there is a chance of bringing back aliens with you. So again, either secure the corridor from there in the tractor beam room that leads to the rest of the ship or the harvester room itself. And I have had a couple of instances where something came out of the refinery. I believe that's because supposedly they're in the ore. I'm not 100% sure if that was accurate, but I would still secure that room anyway. So that's my 3 risk rooms that I consider your points of infestation or invasion. Speaking of infestation and invasion, the next point is check your wrist indicator. Now this is not something, I'm kind of surprised that this isn't actually in the tutorial, but it's not in the tutorial anywhere that I know of, and it's never really explicitly mentioned. You can only see it when you're using something like a rifle or the collector. You don't see it when you have the pistol, but if you're using a rifle or something, you have on your left wrist a indicator which gives you your health level, which is the number, and then there's a little green orb on the side of your wrist. If that's green and there's nothing else going on, then you're fine. If there's a red half arc type of shape in one of the 4 cardinal directions, then that's showing you where there's a threat. So this applies to when you're on your ship as well as when you're on an expedition. Now, I have read reports that when you're on your ship and there's an alien invasion, but you don't actually know where they are, the whole thing will just turn red. I've not experienced that myself, but keep it in mind. But when you're on board and you see where the aliens are, or you're on the ground on an expedition and it says that a life form's been detected, you usually get one of the 4 main directions light up in red that tells you where the threat's coming from. It's very useful for keeping yourself kind of oriented as where everything is coming from and where you're getting attacked from, because it can be very easy to lose sight of enemy things and stuff like that. The next point would be to actually go on expeditions because of that very reason that I mentioned in my previous point about the aliens don't typically come back with you. That's not the only reason, but it's one of the big ones. And it's actually some of the most fun part of the gameplay without being invaded. If you never get invaded, you never really fight anything on a normal basis, so that's where most of the action comes from, is going down to a planet. But one of the big things is, like I said, it doesn't bring back aliens, but the other is that that's where you get your upgrades from, by going down to the planets and taking over sites and things like that. So I do encourage you to go with it. Plus, it's a 3-man team instead of a 2-man team, so, you have better odds of everybody surviving. With that in mind, the next point is when you're scanning places, look for planets that have sites detected. Sites are where you get your upgrades from and unlock new blueprints for new rooms or new weapons or various other different things. So be sure that when you're scanning planets and things and you're going to go down, sometimes you have to go down to a planet because it has a resource you need and there's just no way around it. But if you can find one that has a site, then you have a chance of coming back with another blueprint or an upgrade or something like that. So I highly recommend going for those planets. I don't believe that's actually mentioned in the tutorial. The tutorial tells you to go down and it just explains how expeditions work, but it doesn't really explain very well how sites work. So I definitely encourage that because that's the main source of your upgrades aside from killing aliens and stuff, which still typically happens on expeditions. With that in mind, how to properly go safely on an expedition, I do recommend at least bringing a couple turrets with you, and if you have the resources, an energy shield, you should start off the tutorial with, like, I think enough lithium to make one barrier, and you should come stocked with 2 turrets. Now, turrets are not reloadable. When they blow up or run out of ammo, they blow up. You can't reload them. So I do recommend prioritizing stuff like sulfur and iron early game, because sulfur lets you build more turrets, which you could fairly use a lot of them when you're first starting off. But if you're short, I do recommend taking turrets from the ship, which is my next point. So if you really need them, as far as I know, again, in my experience, the ship does not keep going while you're on an expedition. I believe it's an either-or situation. So you're safe to take turrets from your ship and take them down with you and use them on the ground if you don't have enough to make extras. If you need to heal, my next point would be about healing. I don't know why this doesn't really come up, but as far as I know, it may come up once in the tutorials if you're watching all of the videos and reading all the PDA messages, but it doesn't make it super clear. But there's wall terminals in your modules on your ship as well as in the harvester that you land on that has biomass that allows you to heal. So knowing where those terminals are on your ship is probably a good idea, because then if you get into an infestation situation or something like that, you can heal yourself. Do note, though, the biomass used on your harvester and your ship are 2 different things. While your harvester is docked, it will use your ship's biomass, but when you land, it'll always start with 0, and so you get biomass from killing aliens. Now, if you fully loaded the harvester up and you've got a bunch of biomass, then when you leave, it does actually go to your ship. But just a note that you don't start off with your ship's resources when you land. Another point is you should always have at least 1 bridge crew member. It's not a have to, but I highly recommend it because of one reason. When you're scanning on the bridge, it'll scan in a 3x3 grid around the system that you're in. So although when you're scanning, you may have scanned all of the stuff that's in that system, and so your tractor beam and your harvester are good to go, you know what you have access to. But while you're doing those other things, if you have a bridge crew member, they will continue to scan, so then if you need other resources or you want to look for something else, you can actually find that it's scanned the surrounding other 8 systems around you, if they're there. I mean, if they're not a blank square. So you can do it manually, but I highly recommend at least having 1 crew member on the bridge at all times, because then whenever you hyper jump anywhere, they'll just start scanning whatever is around you, which comes in handy when you're doing other things and then you go back and you've already got the information you need as to what's going on and where. The last point, it's kind of self-explanatory, but it is something that gets overlooked in the tutorial and doesn't really take much of a note, is to pay attention to the danger level of a system. Again, it seems like it'd be common knowledge, but it doesn't really stand out too much as far as a whole lot of blinking lights or something to go, hey, don't go here early game. And so I've actually gotten a few comments on my last video about people that weren't aware of it and jumped and ended up in a high danger system and, just got invaded and their ship blew up, just a mess. So when you're starting out, normally in my experience, I haven't run into too many high danger zones in my beginner. Like by the time I was done with the tutorial, maybe I ran into a couple, but before finishing the tutorial section of how to play, never really came up. But so paying attention to the danger level and stuff is very important. So yeah, with that, I think I'm going to wrap up this video. Eventually I'm going to be doing a Let's Play on this series. However, I'm going to be taking a break from YouTube for a little bit because I had some personal stuff I needed to deal with, and so I didn't want to start a Let's Play series with episode 1 and kind of go over these points and then have to, basically bail on it for a while and come back way later. So for now, I figured I'd just leave you guys with these top points that I've kind of uncovered while playing that I thought might be helpful for newer players, so it kind of is being dubbed as sort of like a beginner's guide to get you through the tutorial type area of the game and get you going on your own playthrough. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up here. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, and if you'd like to see more of these kinds of like guide tutorial type things over standard Let's Plays, do let me know in the comments or through messages. It would help me out a lot to know that. But I'm going to wrap things up here. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, and I will see you all next time. Peace.